Hi, thanks for being with me today. I'm Jeff Stark. As I indicated in the first video, this being the second video on the theme of forgiveness, in the first video I mentioned that we're going to put out a number of videos concerning the theme of forgiveness, and they're going to be not in any kind of sequence or any particular kind of order or in terms of any kind of a priority. Rather, they're going to just be snapshots about things that we can learn and we should be applying to our lives as we go about our day-to-day living, having to look to this matter of confession and forgiveness on a daily basis, perhaps. So this is our second video and a second snapshot concerning things that are pertinent for us to know about this matter of forgiveness. So let's get started in snapshot video number 2 on forgiveness. What I'd like to pass along to you about this particular video about forgiveness is that forgiveness has very much a quality and a quantity to it, if I can put it in those terms. But let me give you a metaphor that we'll use to show to you what I'm talking about there. The metaphor has to do with personal injury, when we get injured and how long it takes to really heal. So for example, if I cut my finger on a piece of paper, well, actually, there you go. If you cut your finger on a piece of paper, you put a Band-Aid on it, and it's probably take the Band-Aid off, and tomorrow, and it's all healed. It's a slight injury, and there's a very quick recovery from it. Now, you can get a little bit more serious than a paper cut. You can remember when I was young, I broke one of my fingers and I put a stint on it for about 6 weeks, took it off after about 6 weeks, a little bit of physical therapy, and my finger was back to health. A little bit more serious, a little bit longer of a recovery, but nonetheless, not too serious, and back playing ball within 6 to 7 weeks, something like that. Now, there was also a time when, very recently, I fractured my tibia in my leg, and that was a much more serious injury. And the length of time of recovery was about 9 weeks on crutches, and then I started walking, and another 2 or 3 weeks of physical therapy, and within that period of time of about 4 or 5 months, I was back to walking and running and biking and doing the things that I wanted to do. But the point being, that was a more serious injury, which required a longer period of time and a much harder effort to recover and to get well. Now, worst case scenario would be something like, for example, I'm looking at my iPhone, I'm crossing the street, and I get hit by an 18-wheeler. And it hits me going about 45 miles per hour. It throws me maybe 30, 40, 50 feet down the road. I tumble, I fall, I get banged into a lamp post. And so that's a very, very life-threatening injury. I've got multiple bones, fractured back, hips broken, concussions, eye problems, memory problems, and I'm going to be in the IC unit for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks perhaps. And my life may be teetering on living, dying. And if I do well, if God blesses and the doctors do their thing and I heal well, after I'm done in this very serious IC unit, I'm going to go upstairs in a hospital room for probably a week or 2 or 3, recuperating out of the IC unit upstairs, constant medical attention, and a body cast and IV fluids running in and out of me, and I'll be there probably for another month. If that goes well, then I'll probably be able to come home in a wheelchair, and I'll be in that wheelchair or in my bed, perhaps in my bedroom, for another 2 or 3 weeks, and then I might transition to walking to the bathroom and then walking to the living room. If that goes well, I'll walk to the kitchen. If that goes well over a series of many weeks, eventually I'm going to be able to walk and get the mail, walk around the block. But you understand what I'm saying. That was a very serious injury, And the length of time of recovery and the effort that it took to recover well took a long time because of the quality and quantity of that injury. The recovery time was much longer, much more serious, and took a lot more effort. Now, here's the application. There are personal injuries that we might, and sins against one another that we might even compare to a paper cut. I'm slightly rude to my wife. I acknowledge it. I recognize it. I notice by the look in her eye that I've offended her. And she may say, that really hurt my feelings. And I'll say, I'm sorry. I blew it. That was not a kind thing to say. I'm sorry, and will you forgive me? And it's a slight thing, but nonetheless a thing for which I hurt my wife slightly, and she let me know that she was slightly hurt, and I nonetheless asked her forgiveness for being rude and being unkind. But that's it's kind of one and done. A slight injury, a brief and quick confession, and a granting of forgiveness happened pretty quickly. Now, there are other sins that we commit against each other that can be more serious than that, like the finger broken. Well, there might be an argument or a quarrel that a husband and wife have, a more serious injury against each other, which takes a more dedicated confession on the part of both of them. And forgiveness is a little bit more challenging because it was a quarrel and a lot of things were said, not just one thing, but nonetheless, it was a more serious personal injury to one another, requiring a deeper and a more concerted effort on the part of the two people to confess genuinely, seriously, and granting a forgiveness that may be a little bit harder to do because the injury was more serious than a paper cut. Now, you move on to a broken collarbone or a broken leg, and you got nine weeks of recovery and physical therapy, and maybe there's yelling and shouting and name calling. You don't talk to each other for 3 days or something like that, and a much more serious injury and sin against one another. Well, the confession that the perpetrator would have to do at that point cannot treat that kind of broken leg, broken collarbone, or sin against the other person, cannot treat that like a paper cut. And so that confessor needs to confess on the level of the fact that it's much more serious, much more dangerous, damaging, and much more injurious than a paper cut. So the confession ought to be deeply thought out. It must be thorough. It must be specific. It must be much more deeply genuine and sincere in their apology, and a much more elaborate in helping that person say, I know how I hurt you, here's how I hurt you. Now, the forgiveness that's going to be granted to that person is going to be more challenging than if it was just a paper cut injury. Something awful was said, some things were done, it was much more serious, and forgiveness. The confession's going to have to be commiserate with the crime, if I can put it that way. It wasn't a paper cut, it was much more serious. And the forgiveness is going to be harder to grant than a paper cut because it was more serious of an injury. Now, what about the 18-wheeler? Well, there are situations that happen in life between husbands and wives, I'll use that as an example, which are 18-wheeler-like experiences. Like if a man leaves his wife and has an affair with another woman. Well, that is not a paper cut. That's not a broken finger. That's not a broken hip. That is like being hit by an 18-wheeler emotionally and psychologically, and it's like being tossed out in front of an 18-wheeler. You're thrown 100 feet. You have multiple bones. You have concussions. You have eye problems. You have hip problems. You have backbone problems. You have concussion and memory problems. And to recover from an affair, assuming the husband comes clean, two things have to happen. Number one is the husband has to own up to the fact that what he did was wrong and sinful. And his confession to his wife is going to have to be commiserate, not with a paper cut or a broken finger or a broken leg, but his confession is going to have to be commiserate with injuring a person who's going to be in the IC unit for 3 or 4 weeks, upstairs 3 or 4 weeks, at home 4 or 5 or 6 weeks, and probably within a year to a year and a half, maybe getting about walking and maybe getting back on their bike, and maybe even limping to some degree for the rest of their life because of the seriousness of the injury. So, when there are 18-wheeler sorts of experiences, sins against another person, the confession on the part of that kind of experience is not one and done. When there is an affair and the wife has been hit by an 18-wheeler, it's going to take it's a very, very serious injury that is going to take a long, long time to recover from. It's going to take over a year, possibly 2, possibly 3. The husband who is asking for forgiveness, it's going to take a long time for the wife to be able to forgive the husband in a way that restores the peace and the stability and the steadiness and the well-being of that relationship. When you confess your sins of adultery to a wife, she cannot forgive you as though it was a paper cut. It's going to take a long time on her part, even if she's a good wife, a godly woman. But remember now, whether you're a godly wife and a good wife or not, or even if you are, you've been hit by an 18-wheeler. You could be a terrible wife and you're going to be hit by an 18-wheeler, or you're a good wife, you got hit by an 18-wheeler. You're both going to be in the IC unit for weeks and upstairs for weeks. And the injury is very, very serious. And so the confessor needs to confess 25, 50, 75, 100 times over the next year and a half to the wife, confessing again he's sorry for what he did. And not get impatient and not get impatient about her difficulty in this matter. The wife who says she's going to forgive her husband has to understand forgiveness has a quality and quantity to it. In this case, it's not a paper cut. It's a life and death situation. And the wife is going to have to take, even a good godly wife is going to have to take a long, long time to be able to forgive her husband. She may say, I forgive you, but 2 hours later, it's running through her mind. She can't get it out of her mind, and she's hurt. She's upset again. And that's the 45th time or the 65th time or the 75th time that's happened. She comes and talks to her. She says, why'd you do that? And what did you do? And where'd you go? And he's thinking to himself, if he's thinking to himself, hey, this is a broken finger, this is the 35th time she's wanted to have the same conversation. I mean, what's going on here? You said you forgave me. Why don't you forgive me? You should be done with this. No. The husband is very, very wrong in that matter. It's not over and done. It's not a broken bone. This is a very, very serious thing. Serious injury taking a long time to recover. And it's going to involve, again, 2 things. Number 1, the perpetrator, the one who had the affair, is going to have to confess those sins and ask forgiveness many, many, many times. And if the couple does well, they're going to be able to come out of this. But the wife has to also understand that this is not a paper cut and it's not a broken finger. Even if the husband wants to think and act as though it is, it isn't. And so a wife may have to grant forgiveness 50, 75, 100 times. And if it goes well, then that injury is going to heal, but in the frequency of talking about it, having to confess it, and having to forgive it is going to get farther and farther apart until eventually, after a long time, the subject of the affair will only come up maybe once every 2 or 3 months. Eventually, maybe every 6 months. Maybe eventually every 9 months. Maybe eventually once a year the affair will come up. But even then, a year later, when that subject comes up, the husband, the perpetrator, needs to humble himself because of the degree of injury, needs to once again confess to his wife that what he did was wrong. And the wife needs to forgive, again, the husband who perpetrated the sin and the injury against her. So here's the point about video number 2 here on forgiveness. Forgiveness in some situations is one and done, like a paper cut. But when the injury is more serious than that, then confession and forgiveness is a harder thing to do and takes a longer time to do. And then sometimes, like when you've been hit with an affair on the part of your husband, forgiveness is going to take a long time. Now, wives, you need to understand this, as you're the one who's extending forgiveness, that it's going to take you a long time to forgive. In best case scenario, in the case of an affair, best case will be once every 9 months or a year, this subject will come up. You'll have to talk to your husband about it again, and he'll have to ask your forgiveness. And hopefully you'll be in a place of being able to forgive him for what he did by God's grace. But again, in conclusion, the point of video number 2 here relative to forgiveness is, in some situations, forgiveness can be given one and done. But in other more serious situations, forgiveness takes a very, very long time to be able to do. Fortunately, for God, all sins are once and done. But that's not true for us, as we have to live in this life, and where our hurts and injuries can be much more serious to each other. And when they're as serious as having a marital affair, well, forgiveness is something that's going to be not one and done, but something that's going to have to be worked on for a long, long, long time. Hope that's helpful to you as you consider, as you qualitatively and quantitatively work through these various injuries that you have with one another. And I think if I could just close with this PS. One of the things that I have to have couples do is to help, for example, the man to understand, hey, this injury that you've committed against your wife with an affair is not a broken leg which is recovered in 3 months. This is not a 3-month injury. This is an 18-month recovery, a 20-month recovery. And you cannot expect your wife to recover in 3 months when it's going to legitimately take 18 to 24 months. Okay? I hope that's helpful. See you in video number 3.